Elias Carter had never believed in setups. Not the blind date kind, not the well-meaning kind arranged by coworkers who swore they knew exactly the right person. He had stopped believing in a lot of things after the hospital, after the machines went quiet, after the drive home alone. But when Victoria Hale, the coldest, most unreachable woman in the entire orbit of Hale Dynamics, told him she had found someone suitable for him, he said yes, not because he wanted to, because his daughter Lily had been watching him too carefully for too long, and she had asked him, just that morning, in a voice too gentle for a 7-year-old, whether he was lonely. He had told her no. He had lied. That evening, inside a restaurant lit the color of warm honey, Elias stood up as the door opened, and the lie cracked clean in half. Because the woman who walked through that door was not a stranger. It was Victoria, and for the first time since he had known her, she was not looking at him like an employee. She was looking at him like a man. The toast came out slightly burned that Tuesday morning, the way it always did when Elias's mind was already 3 steps ahead of his hands. He scraped the dark edges over the sink, spread a thin layer of butter across what remained, and set the plate down in front of Lily before she could notice. She noticed, anyway, the way children always do. She just chose not to say anything about the toast. Instead, she wrapped both hands around her orange juice glass and looked at him with those careful brown eyes that had belonged to her mother. "Daddy," she said, "are you lonely?" Elias kept his back to her for a moment longer than necessary, rinsing the knife under the tap. The question landed somewhere behind his sternum and stayed there. "Not when I have you," he said, turning around with a smile that reached his eyes just barely far enough to satisfy a 7-year-old. Lily studied him the way she studied puzzles, looking for the missing piece, the place where the shape didn't quite fit. Then she picked up her toast and bit into it, and the moment passed. But the question did not. Elias had been freelancing for 3 years. After Claire died, the structure of an office, the commute, the forced conversations at the coffee machine, the obligation to perform normalcy under fluorescent lights had felt impossible. He had good instincts with code, and good instincts had been enough to keep the bills paid and Lily in the school she loved, the one with the art teacher who let her make a mess on Fridays. He was not ambitious. He did not want to be. He wanted to be home when Lily got off the bus, and he wanted to be the one making dinner, even when dinner was slightly wrong. The project from Hale Dynamics had arrived 6 weeks earlier, a mid-level contract for internal platform development. Larger in scope than anything he usually took on, with a flat fee that had made him read the email twice. He had agreed without fully understanding who Hale Dynamics was, and then done the research afterward, the way he often did things. What he found was a company built in 15 years from nothing into a firm managing assets and infrastructure across 11 states, led entirely by a woman who had turned 38 last spring and had no visible personal life that any journalist had successfully documented. He had set the research aside and started writing the code. In a drawer on his nightstand, beneath a paperback he hadn't opened in 8 months, there was a wedding ring. He had not worn it in over a year. He had not thrown it away. He kept it the way people keep things they are not ready to decide about, quietly, in the dark, in a place where no one else had to look at it. Hale Dynamics occupied the top 4 floors of a glass building downtown that reflected the sky in a way that always made the clouds look more dramatic than they were. Elias arrived that first Wednesday morning with his laptop bag and his visitor badge, and the particular discomfort of a man who works alone walking into a place that had a brand identity. Everything was polished. The reception desk was staffed by a woman who smiled in a way that felt rehearsed but not unkind, and the elevator played no music, which Elias appreciated. The workspace they had assigned him was on the 31st floor open plan, all glass and pale steel, with a view of the river that he might have found beautiful if he were the kind of person who remembered to look up. He set his bag down, opened his laptop, and told himself this was just another contract. He heard her before he saw her. Not her voice, she was not speaking. He heard the change in the room, the subtle recalibration that happens when someone with authority enters a space. Keyboards paused a half-second, then resumed. Conversations dropped a register. Elias looked up. Victoria Hale crossed the floor with the particular economy of someone who had long ago stopped wasting movement. She wore a charcoal blazer and did not carry anything in her hands. Her hair was pulled back in a way that looked effortless and almost certainly was not. When her gaze swept the room, it moved the way a searchlight moves, steady, indifferent, complete. When it landed on Elias, it stopped for exactly one beat. She did not walk over. Her assistant, a quick-moving woman named Clara, materialized instead and told him there would be a brief orientation meeting at 11. Victoria had already looked away. Later that afternoon, he was introduced formally, not by handshake, but by a slight nod that implied the handshake had been considered and deemed unnecessary. Her voice was even, pitched low, and carried no warmth but also no hostility. She told him the project scope in 4 sentences, and then asked if he had questions. He had 2. She answered both without elaborating, and then she was gone. He sat with the strangeness of it for a moment. Then he went back to the code. The micro-moment happened on his 5th day, during the lunch hour. He had stepped into one of the smaller conference rooms with the glass walls, the ones people used for phone calls when they needed the illusion of privacy, and pulled up a video call with Lily, who was at her grandmother's house and wanted to show him a drawing she had made of a horse that was also, she explained, a dragon. He had laughed at the horse dragon for longer than was probably dignified, and Lily had laughed back with her whole body the way she always did, rocking sideways in her chair. When the call ended, he turned and discovered that Victoria Hale was standing outside the glass wall, a tablet in one hand, her eyes on him. She was not watching in any invasive sense, she was simply there, and she had not looked away in time. Their eyes met. She held it for 2 full seconds, which was 1 second longer than she had held anything that wasn't work-related since he'd known her. Then she turned and walked toward the elevators. Elias put his phone away and went back to his desk and thought nothing of it. Not yet. Clara had worked for Victoria Hale for 6 years, and in those 6 years, she had learned to read the small tells, the way the corner of Victoria's mouth tightened when a meeting ran long, the way she stood at the window when something was bothering her, and stared at the city as though it owed her an answer. She had also learned that Victoria would not discuss any of it willingly, so Clara had learned to choose her moments. She chose one on a Thursday afternoon, when Victoria was reviewing contract terms and the office had emptied for a late lunch. "You don't need better control," Clara said, setting a coffee on the corner of the desk without being asked. "You need connection." Victoria did not look up from the page. "That's a therapy quote I read," Clara said. She paused. "Elias Carter's contract is up in 3 weeks. The sentence landed with more weight than its words carried, and both women knew it. Victoria's pen stopped moving, though her eyes did not change. "He's good," Clara added. "At the work, and at other things. He's a contractor. He's also a person." Clara picked up a folder, preparing to leave, and then stopped. "When's the last time you had dinner with someone who wasn't also in the room for a business reason?" Victoria's silence was its own answer. The following day, Elias was in the break room when Marcus from infrastructure came in looking gray-faced, carrying a laptop and the particular despair of someone who had made an error that was going to cascade. Elias asked what was wrong, listened to the explanation, and spent 40 minutes helping Marcus untangle a database configuration problem that had nothing to do with Elias's contract, and everything to do with the fact that Elias could see a solution and was not the kind of person who walked past one. He asked for nothing. He told Marcus to get some lunch. He went back to his own work as though it hadn't happened. Victoria had observed this from across the floor. She did not say anything to him about it that day. She said something 3 days later. She appeared beside his workstation at 5:15, when most of the floor had cleared. He looked up, unsure whether he'd missed a notification about a meeting. She clasped her hands behind her back and looked at him directly. "I've identified someone who might be suitable for you," she said. "A dinner introduction. This Saturday." Elias blinked. Whatever he had expected her to say, that was not it. "I'm not," he started. "You're a single parent who works from home and attends no social events," she said, not unkindly. You won't find someone on your own, not because you aren't capable, but because you aren't trying. The accuracy of this, delivered without malice, was somehow worse than rudeness would have been. I appreciate the thought, he said. But think about it, she said, and walked away. That evening he told Lily the story over dinner, leaving out the part about not trying, and Lily listened with both elbows on the table and her chin in her hands. You should go, Daddy, she said. You think so? Maybe she's nice. Elias looked at his daughter, at the hope she wore on her face so openly, the hope that was also a small mirror of something he had buried. He texted Victoria the following morning. Saturday works. What he did not know then, what would only become clear when the restaurant door opened, was that Victoria had spent the better part of 2 days asking him questions, framed as logistics, what kind of food he preferred, whether he minded quiet places, whether he was allergic to anything, whether he valued conversation or preferred comfortable silence. He had answered each question as though they were practical. She had answered each question as though she were choosing for herself. Because she was. The restaurant was called Meridian. It was the kind of place where the tablecloths were changed between courses, and the lighting had been designed by someone who understood that the right color of warmth could make a person feel held. Elias arrived 7 minutes early, which was his nature, and sat across from an empty chair and turned his water glass a quarter turn to the left 3 times before he stopped himself. He was not good at this. He had not done this in 9 years, the first date thing, the stranger across the table thing. Claire had not been a stranger when they fell in love. She had been his college roommate's sister, familiar from a dozen shared gatherings before he had understood what she meant to him. The slow accumulation of knowing someone was something he understood. This sharp beginning, this cold start, was not. He looked at the empty chair. His internal voice was matter of fact. This was a mistake. At 7:43, the front door opened. Elias Carter saw her before he understood what he was seeing. The instinct to stand was social, automatic, a man rising to greet a woman arriving. He was halfway to his feet before recognition reached him like cold water, like the floor dropping half an inch, like a sound suddenly cutting out. Victoria Hale stood in the entrance of Meridian in a deep blue dress that was nothing like what she wore to the office, her hair down around her shoulders in a way that rearranged his understanding of her face. She saw him the instant she entered. She did not hesitate, or flinch, or look apologetic. She crossed the room toward him with the same composure she carried everywhere except that something in it was different, softer by some margin he could not yet measure, like a window cracked open an inch. He sat back down as she reached the table, and the silence between them lasted long enough to be its own kind of conversation. You set me up, he said finally, with yourself. She settled into the chair across from him, smoothed the napkin across her lap, and looked at him with an evenness that he was beginning to understand was not coldness, but rather the careful architecture of a woman who did not allow herself to be surprised. I didn't trust anyone else to choose, she said. Elias looked at his water glass. He looked at the candle. He looked at her. That is, he said slowly, either the most arrogant thing I've ever heard, or the most honest. It can be both, she said. A waiter appeared. They ordered. Victoria knew the menu and then sat with the particular stillness of 2 people who had arrived at something neither had fully intended. Elias felt the tension not as hostility but as charge, like the air before a storm that might or might not arrive. He noticed small things about her that he had not been permitted to notice in the office. The way she held her wine glass by the stem, the faint shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of a life run hard and late, the way she looked at him when she thought he wasn't watching. The evening moved unevenly, like a record that catches and then finds its groove. There were stretches of careful, probing conversation and stretches of quiet that neither of them rushed to fill. And then something shifted slowly, beneath the surface. The way weather changes before you can see it, and it was no longer a negotiation. Before they left, as the restaurant had emptied to a handful of tables, Elias looked at her in the candlelight and allowed himself to feel, for a few seconds, the exact shape of what was in front of him. Then he put it away carefully, the way he put away the ring. Not discarded, not decided, just held. Victoria smiled at him as they stood to leave. It was brief and quiet, and it transformed her entirely. It was the first time he had seen it, and he understood, with the certainty that comes before logic, that very few people ever had. The drive back was quiet. But it was a different kind of quiet now. In the restaurant, Victoria had asked him the question with no preface, no diplomatic softening. Why did you stop trying? Not at work, not at life, at the specific thing between people that requires courage, the trying that makes you visible. He had answered without planning to. Because I had something real once, he said. And when it was gone, everything else felt like a bad copy. The honesty had surprised them both. He had looked at the table for a moment after saying it, as though the words were still in the air and he was deciding whether to take them back. He did not. Victoria had been quiet for a beat. Then, in a voice that lost some of its precision, not much, but enough, she told him about Marcus Hale. Not her father, whose name the company carried, but the man she had been engaged to at 32, the one who had told her she was extraordinary and then, when the opportunity presented itself, had leveraged what she had trusted him with to secure a deal that made him wealthy and left her company exposed. She had handled it. She had not broken. She had tightened every wall, raised an inch higher, every door latched more firmly until control was not a strategy but a way of being. I stopped trusting people to make choices I would have to live with, she said, so I stopped letting them. Elias understood this in a way that required no translation. Two people who had learned that love produces wreckage and had chosen the same solution removed the variable. He understood, too, that this was what made both of them wrong. By the end of the evening, Elias had not agreed to anything and had not refused anything either. He had simply remained present, which was more than he had managed in a very long time, and which cost him more than he could have explained. It was Lily who moved the thing forward, the way children do, not by wisdom exactly, but by the specific gravity of their honesty. Victoria arrived at the house on a Wednesday afternoon with a question about project documentation that could have been handled by email, but had not been handled by email. She stood in his doorway in a jacket and dark jeans, looking at the narrow house with its wooden porch and its potted plants, and its bicycle leaned against the side wall, and something crossed her face that was not discomfort exactly, but rather the expression of someone encountering a language they had not prepared to speak. Lily was inside, at the kitchen table with markers uncapped and a project about volcanoes that had spread to 3 separate pieces of paper. She looked up when the door opened, looked at Victoria with the unmoderated assessment of a child, and said nothing for 6 full seconds. "Are you the one from the restaurant?" she asked. "Yes," Victoria said. Lily looked at her with continued seriousness. "Do you make my dad sad?" Elias started to intervene. Victoria raised one hand, not harshly, but clearly, and answered before he could. "Not on purpose," she said. "I'm still learning how not to." Lily considered this response with the gravity of a small judge. She appeared to find it acceptable. She slid a marker across the table toward Victoria. "You can help with the lava," she said. "It's supposed to be orange, but I only have red." Victoria sat down at the kitchen table in her $180 jacket and uncapped the red marker, and helped a 7-year-old figure out what orange looked like when you only had red and yellow, and when Lily laughed at something, the lava looked, she decided, like cheese. Victoria laughed too. Not a polite sound. A real one, sudden and unguarded, that she seemed to notice a half-second after it happened, and did not try to take back. Elias stood in the kitchen doorway and watched and said nothing because there was nothing to say that the moment wasn't already saying. The weeks that followed had a different texture than anything Elias had known in years. They were ordinary in their details: a Saturday afternoon at the park where Lily insisted on showing Victoria how to go down the slide correctly, a Sunday evening where Elias cooked pasta, and Victoria sat on the kitchen counter and offered opinions on garlic quantities that were exactly as authoritative as everything else, she said. but ordinary felt extraordinary because he had gone so long without it. He began to look forward to things. He began, incrementally, to open. Victoria moved through this with a care that surprised him, not in the sense of a calculated performance, but in the way a person is careful with something they know is fragile, something they are aware they could damage with a wrong movement. She did not push. She arrived, and she stayed, and she left without demands, and she came back. But the world outside the house had its own opinions. Derek Marsh had been at Hale Dynamics for 11 years, and he had opinions about most things, particularly about Victoria Hale, whom he had once expected to be an ally and had discovered instead to be immovable. He was broad-faced and quick-smiled and had the particular talent of making concern sound like friendship. When he noticed Victoria's energy had shifted something in how she handled the end of her days, some new economy in her attention, he began to watch. It took him 2 weeks to connect it to Elias. The rumor did not announce itself. It moved the way rumors do, through the understated channel of implication, a raised eyebrow in a meeting, a comment at the coffee machine designed to sound offhand. The word Derek chose, when he chose a word, was positioning, as in, that contractor has been positioning himself for a while, as in, smart move for someone with limited options. Elias heard it on a Tuesday, from Marcus, who looked uncomfortable delivering it and said, "I thought you should know," in the tone of someone delivering bad news to a good person. He found Victoria that evening, after hours, on the 31st floor. She was at her desk. She did not look up immediately when he entered, which meant she was genuinely concentrated and not performing it. "I won't be your secret," he said. She looked up then. The silence that followed was not comfortable. He watched the calculations move behind her eyes, all the things she managed, all the variables she had spent years keeping aligned, and he understood that what he was asking was not small. He was asking her to let something be uncontrolled. She said nothing. He nodded slowly, in the way that men nod when they have said what they needed to say and are now prepared to live with the answer. "I understand," he said. The days after that were flat and gray in a way he recognized from a time he did not like to return to. He got Lily to school, and he picked her up, and he made dinners, and he ran his code, and he went to sleep at a reasonable hour. And the routine was fine. The routine was enough. It was what routine was for, to be enough when nothing else was. Lily asked, 4 days later, whether Victoria was coming back. Elias said he wasn't sure. Lily was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, in a very small voice, "Did she leave because of me?" The question struck him somewhere deep and specific. The place in a parent where guilt and love are stored so close together they sometimes trip over each other. He crouched down to her level and took both her hands and told her, with as much completeness as 7 years old could hold, that no one had left because of her, that she was the best part of every day he had ever had, that this had nothing to do with her at all. Lily nodded as though she believed him. He thought she probably believed him 60% of the way, and he stored the remaining 40% as a debt he would need to repay. Back at Hale Dynamics, Victoria had returned to what she was before. The walls were up and the gaze was sharp and the calendar was full. Clara watched from the distance that wisdom had taught her to maintain and said nothing for 5 days. On the 6th day, she set a coffee down and said, "He didn't ask you to stop being who you are. He asked you to stop pretending he wasn't there." Victoria did not respond. That evening, she sat at her window for a long time, looking at the city that owed her nothing, and found for the first time in a long time that the view felt empty. Clara did not do things carelessly. When she started looking into Derek Marsh, she did it the way she did everything, quietly, thoroughly, without announcing her conclusions until she had enough of them to be certain. What she found was a pattern. Derek had been sourcing stories, not planting them publicly, which would have been traceable, but seeding them internally into the conversations of people who talked, letting the current carry the narrative where he needed it to go. The gold digger framing around Elias had not come from nowhere. It had been constructed carefully by a man who understood that reputation is a scaffolding, and that the quickest way to destabilize something strong is to undermine the structure supporting it. There was more. A board meeting was being arranged not through the formal calendar, but through the quiet convening of 3 members whose allegiance to Hale Dynamics was in practice an allegiance to profit margins. Derek had been working them for weeks, building the case that Victoria's recent distraction represented a leadership risk. He had not mentioned Elias by name in those conversations. He had not needed to. Clara brought what she had to Elias on a Thursday afternoon in a coffee shop 2 blocks from his house. She set the documents on the table between them and let him read, and watched his face as the architecture of what had happened became clear. He read it twice. Then he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment in the way of a man sorting through something large. "She knew?" he asked, not accusingly. "Searching. She suspected," Clara said. "She didn't tell you because she thought it would make you a target. She was managing the exposure." Elias was quiet. He turned his coffee cup around on its saucer. "She didn't control me," he said. Not to Clara exactly, but to the air, to the thought that had been sitting wrong in him since he walked out of her office. "She chose me, and she was trying to protect what she'd chosen." Clara picked up her own coffee and said nothing, which was the answer. He drove home and sat at his kitchen table and thought about what it meant to be a person who had spent 3 years protecting himself so carefully that he had come to mistake the walls for peace. He thought about Claire and the ring in the drawer and the difference between grief and fear because they were not the same thing, and he had been treating them as though they were. Grief was what you owed someone you had loved. Fear was what happened when you stopped trusting yourself to survive love again. He picked up his phone. He did not call. He set it back down. But something in him had already decided. The board session was not on the public calendar. Derek had arranged it for a Friday morning in the smaller boardroom on the 34th floor, the one used for matters of internal sensitivity, and he had framed the gathering as a routine performance review, the kind of language that opened doors without alarming the people on the other side of them. Victoria arrived knowing what it was. Clara had briefed her at 8 in the morning, standing in the hallway with her coffee and her phone, and the expression of someone who has run the numbers and found them manageable. Victoria had listened, adjusted her jacket, and walked into the room at 9:15 with the composure of a woman who had survived worse. Derek opened with context. He spoke about consistency and optics and the particular vulnerability of a company led by a single executive whose decision-making had become, and here he chose his word with visible care, personal. He did not name names. He spoke about perception, about investor confidence, about the responsibility of leadership to remain, as he put it, unentangled. The Thrift Board members listened. They did not look at Victoria, which was its own statement. When Derek finished, there was a pause. Victoria filled it. "What you're describing," she said, "is a relationship. I am in one. I am not going to discuss the terms of it with you, nor will I manage it according to the preferences of people who would not recognize an ethical conflict if it introduced itself by name." She let this settle, then continued. "But since we are having this conversation, let me be clear. I chose Elias Carter deliberately, not impulsively, not vulnerably, not in a state of compromised judgment, deliberately. I know the difference." The room held. Derek's mouth opened and then closed. "Yes," Victoria said, to no one in particular and to all of them at once. The door at the back of the room opened. Elias had not been expected. He had called Clara that morning, and Clara, exercising the particular judgment that had made her indispensable for 6 years, had given him a time and a floor number and told him the room number before she could stop herself. He stood in the doorway in a shirt that was not the one he wore to freelance assignments, looking at the table and the faces around it and at Victoria, who turned to find him there. He was carrying a folder. Inside the folder were 112 pages of documented communications, emails, forwarded messages, timestamps, an annotated record of Derek Marsh's internal campaign, assembled by a man who wrote code for a living and understood that a trail left in digital form is a trail that can be followed. He walked it to the table. He set it in the center. "I think you'll want to read this before you make any decisions," he said. His voice was steady. He did not look at Derek. He looked only at Victoria, and in the look was everything the last several weeks had been moving toward. Without his permission, the acknowledgement of a feeling too large to keep pretending was manageable. Derek picked up the folder. His face, as he turned the first page, told the room everything it needed to know. The meeting ended 30 minutes later than scheduled, and only 3 people left the room in the same condition they had arrived. The Saturday, 2 weeks after the boardroom, was warm and particular in the way early autumn sometimes is not summer's leftover heat but a new warmth. Deliberate and clean, the kind of day that asks nothing of the people living it. Lily had claimed the backyard as her personal domain and was engaged in a project involving chalk, a garden hose, and an artistic vision that she declined to explain in advance. Victoria was sitting on the back steps, a cup of tea going cold beside her. She had been at the house since morning. She had stayed for breakfast, scrambled eggs that Elias made without burning, and had not invented a reason to leave. She had changed in ways that were small and irreversible. Not softened exactly, because the core of her was still steel, still certain, still the woman who had built something from nothing with her own hands. But the steel was no longer the whole structure. There were other materials, now a willingness to be still, to be seen, to let a morning be just a morning. She had reinstated Marcus Hale's original internal ethics charter, the one that Derek had gradually diluted over the years. She had restructured 2 board positions. She had also, for the first time in 6 years, taken a Friday afternoon. Elias came out through the back door with his own tea and sat beside her on the steps. Lily was drawing something elaborate on the concrete. It appeared to involve dragons again, and possibly a volcano, and at least 1 horse. "She asked me last week," Elias said, "if you were going to be here for her birthday." Victoria looked down at the tea. "November," he added. "Just so you have the date." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'll need to know the theme. She changes it weekly. Then I'll need weekly updates." He smiled at the middle distance. It reached his eyes without effort, without calculation, without the particular strain of a man performing okay. Lily looked up from her drawing and saw them sitting side by side on the steps, and her face did the thing that children's faces do when something they hoped for has arrived without fanfare. She did not say anything. She went back to her dragon. After a moment, Elias turned to look at Victoria. "Still a setup?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment, at the line of his jaw, at the ease that had returned to him in increments, at the man who had walked into a boardroom with a folder, and not for his own sake, but for hers, and had looked at her across the table in front of people who were watching, and had not looked away. "No," she said. She reached over and set her hand on top of his, where it rested on the step between them. "This time, it's a choice." Lily hummed something to herself in the yard. The chalk scraped against the concrete. The morning held the 3 of them lightly, the way good things do not clutched, not forced, but gathered together in the particular luck of people who finally, after a long time of not trying, decided to try.